Welcome to the fifth and the last part of the lecture, Intersectional Ecology for a Politics of Equality. This fifth part is about expanding the community of rights holders for social and environmental justice. In this final part of the lecture, I argue that to deal with existential challenges of pandemics and climate change, we need a shift in global social norms. We need a new ethics and equality politics. Only by giving equal consideration and extending rights to animals, future generations, and the planet, we can move towards social justice for all people. I will start with some quotes from Isaac Bashevis Singer, the 1978 Nobel laureate who fled Nazis in Poland. He wrote, "How can we speak of right and justice if we take an innocent creature and shed its blood?" In their behavior towards creature, all men were Nazis. The smugness with which men could do with other species as he pleased exemplified the most extreme racist theories. The principle that might is right. What gives men the right to kill an animal, often torture it, so that he can fill his belly with its flesh? We know now, as we have always known instinctively, that animals can suffer as much as human beings. Their emotion and their sensitivities are often stronger than those of human beings. And Isaac Bashevis Singer compared species bias to the most extreme racist theories. He argued that animal rights was the purest form of social justice advocacy because animals are the most vulnerable of all the downtrodden. He felt that mistreating animals was the epitome of the might makes right moral paradigm. We trade their most basic and important interests of living and avoid suffering against our ephemeral palate pleasure only because we can. As Jonathan Safran Foer puts it, usually ethical decisions making means choosing between unavoidable and serious conflicts of interest. But in this case, the conflicting interests are these: a human being's desire for a palate pleasure and an animal's interest in not having her throat slit open. Sometimes this argument that animals are different and inferior is used to justify their torture and killing. But this was the same argument used against the giving rights to Black people and women. In 1850s in the United States, this argument was countered by Black feminist Sojourner Truth. She said, "They talk about this thing in their head. What they call it? Intellect," whispers someone nearby. "That's it. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours hold a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full?" And before, in 1789, Jeremy Bentham made a similar point. He was the founder of University College London and the first university in England to welcome students of any religion and to welcome women. He was writing when the French had abolished slavery but British were still treating slaves the way we now treat animals. He wrote, "The day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights which never could have been withholden from them, but by the hand of tyranny. The French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. It may one day come to be recognized that the number of legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. What else is that should trace the insuperable line? Is it the faculty of reason, or perhaps the faculty of discourse? But a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. But suppose they were otherwise, what would it avail? The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And this is from the introduction to the principle of morals and legislation in 1789. If possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his or her own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans? Sorry. For Bentham, the capacity for suffering is what gives equal consideration. The implication of the arguments made so far needs the introduction of a new term: speciesism. Speciesism is a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. And this is from Peter Singer, who wrote more than 40 years ago the book, the seminal book, Animal Rights. Singer explains that racists violate the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of their own race when there is a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. Sexists violate the principle of equality by favoring the interest of their own sex. Similarly, speciesists allow the interest of their own species to override the greater interests of members of other species. The pattern is identical in each case. Do you think it is okay to inflict unnecessary suffering to animals? Why is a dog's or elephant suffering more important than that of a pig or a cow? What entitle has to kill them at the age of a toddler after a life of torture? Veganism is a movement that rejects all forms of human discrimination. Violence is often linked to othering other groups as animals to kill. These are pigs, bastards. This animal metaphor was central to a lot of the genocides and other mass violence in the world. This is the main discourse in war. But also, as Carol Adams explained in her 1990 seminal book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, a feminist vegetarian critical theory, for her, violence against women is intrinsically linked to meat eating. As a result, feminists without veganism is unable to liberate women and brings about and is unable to bring about a more equal world. She describes how feminism and veganism are interconnected. Understanding that everything is connected in our struggle for social justice is fundamental and at the core of the intersectional approach towards justice that I support. To love dogs, eat pigs, and wear cows, we need cognitive dissonance, a sort of continuous denial to be able to deal with a constant moral contradiction. It is only when we free ourselves from the violence and the masculinity models associated with meat eating that we can achieve a more just world. While this part of the lecture focuses on extending rights to animals, I want to go back to additional connection from previous parts of the lectures. The shift to a vegan diet is one example of multiple co-benefits. I try to explain now the importance of moving away from the contradictions of violence and psychological denial associated with causing untold suffering to sentient beings. And veganism contributes to gender and race equality both directly through a shift in gender norms, but also by eliminating other axes of inequalities, including health. Poorest people, migrants, and ethnic minorities tend to live close to polluted areas from intense factory animal farming, but also because these populations are disproportionately affected by malnourishment, particularly obesity, as well as the incidence of cardiovascular diseases and cancer. Moreover, moving to a vegan diet leads to using much less water, much less land, and producing less emissions. The shift will also refocus food markets towards providing enough food for human consumption as opposed to feed animals, and thus eventually can reduce hunger. It will reduce health issues which are unfairly distributed in society, freeing more resources to provide for the well-being of aging populations. It drastically reduced pandemic risk, reducing geopolitical conflicts over water, land, and the intense national competition and nationalism created by pandemics, which, for example, in the UK led to a drastic cut in aid budget, including to Yemen, the most serious humanitarian emergency of our time. The dramatic situation requires no less than a radical transformations of ourselves. And there is no bigger political transformation than changing our diet. The level of ecocide, destruction of the environment, and biocide, the destruction of life, linked to animal farming requires a radical and disruptive change. Social and environmental justice cannot be achieved without a change of ourselves, changing what we eat. For a large number of people in developing countries, their diet is already very similar to a vegan diet. However, the social status associated with meat is driving a rapid exponential growth in meat consumption as soon as income rises, with people on good income in developing countries becoming some of the highest per capita meat consumers globally. But let's go back to our questions. Are my taste buds more important than the life of this animal? How can I morally justify killing this animal unnecessarily just for my pleasure? When we question this, then we start to question other injustices. But the internal denial of this violence, the habit of accepting this violence to billions of sentient beings, prevent from bringing compassion and empathy into our relationship towards others. Violence against women, just for the pleasure of dominion, is just part of this toxic masculinity so central to our meat-eating habit. Let's imagine if a child born into this world were educated to treat all animals with equal respect and compassion, without human-inflicted pain and exploitation. How would that child grow up to harm or oppress another human based on gender, race, sexuality, disability, or any other dimension we use to discriminate and oppress each other? How could they grow hating other humans if they were taught that all life was precious and given basic fundamental rights? Unless we adopt an intersectional perspective on justice struggles, recognizing their interconnectedness, we're not going far. In the current earth, there can't be justice, there can't be social justice, gender equality without veganism. This needs a further shift in morality. When such shift in morality spread, it becomes new social norms. Over time, this becomes a new culture and eventually tradition. Social norms that seems obvious now are incredibly new. The Witchcraft Act was in force until 1736 in Scotland. Less than 300 years ago, thousands of people, mostly women, were legally strangled or burned without any due trial in the UK, just because they were accused of being witches. When slavery is still present, legally it was abolished in the USA only 150 years ago. Still in the USA, it was only a bit more than 50 years ago that Black people obtained civil and political rights, despite, of course, discrimination continuing in the justice system with mass incarceration of young Black people and the economic system marginalizing them. And it was only in the last century that women acquired the right to vote. And not until 1971 in Switzerland. And the racist apartheid legislation remained in place until 1991. In the UK, Section 1 of the Protection of Animals Act of 1911, 110 years ago, states the following: it is an offense to cruelly beat, ill-treat, kick, override, overload, torture, infuriate, or terrify any domestic or captive animal, or if you are the owner of any such animal, permit it to be so used or permit any unnecessary suffering to be caused. Before women had the right to vote in the UK, there was already legislation protecting animals from unnecessary suffering. Of course, the definition of unnecessary suffering used by judges at the time was inappropriate, and the topic that I didn't touch directly but would deserve an entire course is the issue of animal factory farming, where the large majority of commercial meat, dairy, eggs is produced, and its social environmental costs, as well as its cruelty. And I also avoided the issue of the destruction of nature and cruelty of modern fishery. But let's going back to social norms and putting the change that I just described into perspective. Social norms change quite fast, but we need an even faster change to respond to the challenge of pandemics, climate change, and the cry for justice of animals and humans. Are our taste buds worth more, not just than the life of animals, but worth more than our own existence? worth more than life on our planet, and more than every single living being on this planet. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of the United Nations, brings all the government together, clearly states that to mitigate climate change, we may need to move towards a plant-based diet. And I now want to link back to the second part of this lecture, that whereas posterity had previously been regarded as undeserving beneficiaries of inexorable progress, they are now seen as its potential victims. We are destroying the futures. Future generations are our victims. But like witch hunting and slavery, this shift in social norms towards veganism will take place. The question is if it will be soon enough to save this planet and allow decent lives for the most marginalized people. All the evidence used in this lecture is publicly available and uncontroversial. Information on the impact of our choices is there. My hope for the future of humanity, the planet, and my daughters is that veganism is the fastest growing social movement, social justice movement. It has never been easier to make a positive change. Every time you buy something in the supermarket, you vote for an alternative future world, or for not having a future at all. As we said at the beginning of this lecture, every purchase we make has far-reaching consequences on people, animals, and the planet far away, including on people who are not even born yet. Thank you very much. And thank you very much. And if you have questions, comments, please do get in touch. Here there is my email and Twitter account with the reflection and responses. I will be also post full references for all data and information mentioned, as well as a reading list to further explore the issues raised in their lecture.